Hey guys, tonight we are going to travel back to the mid-14th century, but this isn't your typical castles and knights fantasy trip. No, we're diving head first into one of the deadliest moments in human history, and to be honest, your chances of surviving the first few days are, statistically speaking, not great. We're going to experience the world as it was right before it fell apart, to feel the quiet before the storm of the Black Death. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It helps the channel more than you know. And as always, I'd love to see where you're all listening from tonight. So drop your city and the current time in the comments below. It's always cool to see our little community spread across the globe. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. The year is 1346. And for you, life is well. Life. It's predictable. It's mud and straw and the smell of rain-soaked wool. You live in a small, unremarkable town somewhere, in what will one day be called France. Your world is defined by the tolling of the church bell, the gossip at the market, and the rhythm of the seasons. The furthest you've ever traveled is to the next village over. Maybe a two-day walk to sell a few chickens. Your concerns are immediate and earthy. Is the harvest going to be good this year? Will the Lord raise taxes again? Did that baker shortchange you on your last loaf of bread? Tonight, you're in the local tavern. It's a dim, smoky place, smelling of stale ale, sweat, and wet dogs. You're nursing a lukewarm drink, mostly just trying to stay warm, when a stranger enters. As a merchant, you can tell by his weathered cloak and the weary look in his eyes. He has just come from one of the big port cities, a place you've only ever heard of in stories. A place like Genoa or Venice. He buying rounds for anyone who will listen, eager to unburden himself of the tales he collected on his long journey. At first, it's the usual merchant chatter, pirates on the coast, the shifting prices of silk, but then his voice drops, and he starts talking about something else, something he heard from sailors who traveled the Great Silk Road. He speaks of a terrible pestilence, far to the east, in the lands of the Tartars, in a mythical-sounding place called Cathay. He describes, with wide eyes, how it supposedly started. He weaves a story about fire falling from the sky, a foul-smelling mist, and entire cities being wiped out in a matter of days. He says the disease is so potent that even looking at a sick person can kill you. You and the other locals exchange glances. Some of you chuckle into your mugs. It sounds like a ghost story, the kind of exaggerated nonsense travelers spin to feel important. The land of the Tartars. It might as well be the moon. Your world is here, solid and real. The problems you can see and touch are the only ones that matter. Besides, everyone knows that strange events are always happening in those faraway, godless lands. The merchant, seeing your disbelief, leans in closer. He insists this is different. He claims that entire armies of the Great Khan have been decimated, not by swords, but by this invisible foe. He heard that traders in the Black Sea port of Cathay were besieged by a Tartar army, and when the army started dying from this plague, they used their giant catapults to fling the bodies of their dead soldiers over the city walls, poisoning the wells and the people within. This detail gives you a slight pause. It's a grisly, unsettling image, but still, it's a story from a world away, passed through who knows how many mouths. It's likely just a sailor's yarn that got bigger with every telling. The village priest has always taught that pestilence is a punishment from God, sent to cleanse the sinful. And while your village certainly has its share of sinners, you're hardly the great corrupt cities of the East. Surely, God wouldn't concern himself with your little corner of the world. Even today, historians and scientists are still piecing together the puzzle of the plague's origin, trying to pinpoint the exact moment and location where the bacterium Yersinia pestis first jumped from its rodent hosts to the human population. They debate whether a series of environmental changes in the Central Asian steppes, like a drought, forced infected marmots and their fleas into closer contact with nomadic tribes, or if it was simply the expansion of trade routes that disturbed an ancient, dormant pocket of the disease. The story of bodies being catapulted into Cathay is one of those historical accounts that feels both terrifyingly plausible and possibly embellished over time. You finish your drink and head out into the cold night air. The merchant's strange story is already fading from your mind, replaced by the thought of your warm bed. You glance up at the sky. A few months back, there was a strange alignment of planets, and the old women in the village whispered it was a bad omen. But the sky is clear tonight, filled with the same familiar stars that have watched over your village for generations. You pull your cloak tighter, your breath fogging in front of you. The world feels stable. It feels permanent. You have no idea that the stories you just dismissed are not stories at all. They are prophecy, and they are already on their way. A few months pass. The merchant's unsettling stories have faded, buried under the daily grind of your life. Autumn has given way to a damp, cold winter. The world, for you, remains blessedly small and unchanged. But the story has tended. It has simply been sailing. While you were mending your roof and salting meat for the winter, a dozen Genoese trading galleys were making their way across the Mediterranean. They were fleeing the very plague the merchant had described at the Black Sea port of Cathay. They didn't know that they were not escaping the monster, but carrying it with them. One day, another traveler stumbles into your village. This one isn't a worldly merchant with polished stories. He is a pilgrim, his clothes tattered, his eyes wide with a terror that feels fresh, not second-hand. He speaks not of the distant east, but of Sicily, of the port of Messina. His voice trembles as he describes the scene. In October of 1347, those 12 Genoese ships arrived, drifting into the harbor like ghosts. The people of Messina, curious, gathered at the docks to greet them, but no one waved back. The pilgrim tells you that when the harbor officials finally boarded the ships, they were met with a scene from hell. Most of the sailors were already dead, their bodies rotting in their bunks. The few who were still alive were specters, delirious with fever, babbling incoherently, and covered in strange, dark blotches on their skin. And then there were the swellings. He describes them with a shudder, grotesque, egg-sized lumps in their armpits and groins, oozing and dark. The officials, horrified, ordered the death ships out of the harbor immediately. They were driven away, a cursed fleet destined to wander the seas. But it was too late. The sickness was already ashore. And here's the part of the story that the terrified people on the docks completely missed. As the great ropes were tied to the moorings, other passengers had disembarked, unnoticed in the chaos. They were sleek, dark, and moved with a swift confidence. Hundreds of black rats, the ship-dwelling ratus, scurried down the lines and vanished into the warehouses and cellars of Messina. Tucked away in their fur were the true agents of death, fleas carrying the bacterium Yersinia pestis. The rats were the ships, and the fleas were the crew, delivering their deadly cargo to a new continent. You listen, a cold dread seeping into you that was there when the stories were about faraway Cathay. Sicily, that's part of Italy. You know people who have been to Italy. It's no longer a myth. The pilgrim story spreads through your village like wildfire. People gather in the church, praying with a new kind of fervor. You start looking at the rats in your own barn with a flicker of suspicion, a thought you would have laughed at a year ago. The authorities in Messina, and later in other port cities like Genoa and Venice, did what they could. They tried to turn the ships away, sometimes firing flaming arrows at them to prevent them from docking. It's a classic case of shooting the messenger, only the messenger is a giant, plague-ridden ship. This early, desperate attempt at quarantine was, of course, futile. The rats were already ashore, the fleas were already finding new hosts, and the disease was already incubating in the human population. This is a point where historians and scientists still have some debate. The traditional narrative, the one you're hearing now, places the black rat and its fleas at the center of the story. But the sheer speed at which the Black Death spread through Europe has led some to question if that's the whole picture. They argue that maybe the primary vector wasn't just rats, but human fleas and lice. which would explain how it moves so quickly through populations, even in areas with few rats. Others propose that the Black Death wasn't just one disease, but a terrifying cocktail. It might have been primarily bubonic plague, spread by fleas, but it could have easily mutated into its pneumonic form, which is far more terrifying because it spreads directly from person to person through coughing and sneezing. No rats or fleas required. The thought that a simple cough could kill is almost too much to comprehend. For now, all you know is that the monster is no longer a distant legend. It has a foothold in Europe. You hear whispers that it has completely overrun Messina, that people die within days, that families are abandoning their sick, and that dogs are dragging bodies through the empty streets. You try to tell yourself that it's still far away. It's across the water, and then over the mountains. It would take months, years, for it to reach your quiet little village. You cling to this hope like a child clings to a blanket in the dark, but you can feel the map of your world shrinking. The whispers are getting louder. The monster is no longer a world away. It's at the door of your continent, and it's knocking. The winter of 1347 passes into the spring of 1348. The news that trickles into your village is sporadic and often contradictory. Carried by the occasional friar or traveling peddler, you hear that the plague has devoured the great port city of Marseille. You hear that it's climbing its way up the Rhone Valley. Each piece of news is like a stone dropped into a still pond, the ripples of fear spreading outwards, each one getting closer to you. But life, for the most part, goes on. You sow your fields, you fix your tools, you complain about the weather. It's a strange, surreal period of waiting. You know a storm is coming, but all you can see is a clear blue sky. Then, one evening in late spring, it happens. It's not dramatic. There's no clap of thunder or sudden darkness. It begins with a sound, a cough. Your neighbor is a blacksmith, a mountain of a man named Thomas. You've known him your whole life. You've seen him lift anvils that other men can't even budge. His laugh is a booming, infectious thing that echoes through the village square. He is the picture of health and strength. But for the past day, H.E.'s been complaining of a chill he can't shake, a deep ache in his bones, and a pounding headache. His wife says he shivered all through the night, wrapped in every blanket they owned. You see him stumble out of his smithy, leaning against the doorframe for support. His face, usually ruddy from the heat of the forge, is pale and slick with sweat. He tries to smile at you, a weak, ghastly imitation of his usual grin, and then he coughs. It's not a normal cough. It's a deep, wrecking, painful sound that seems to tear up from his very soul. He doubles over, clutching his chest. His wife rushes out, her face a mask of worry. She helps him back inside, shutting the door behind them. The sound of his coughing is muffled now, but you can still hear it. It's the only sound in the sudden, heavy silence that has fallen over your part of the village. Everyone who was outside has frozen, looking at the blacksmith's closed door. No one says a word. This is how it begins. Not with a fleet of death ships or a horde of rats, but with a familiar face suddenly made strange and terrifying. The abstract fear has now become concrete. It has a name, Thomas. It has a location, the house right next to yours. Later that day, the village priest visits the blacksmith's home. He stays for a long time. When he leaves, his face is grim. He tells those who dare to ask that Thomas is in the grip of a powerful fever, and that they must all pray for his soul. The word he uses is pestilence. He doesn't say it loudly. He doesn't have to. The word hangs in the air, thick and suffocating. This is where the first, fatal mistake is made. Repeated in countless villages across Europe, the instinct is to care for the sick. It's a deeply ingrained part of your community. When someone is ill, neighbors bring soup, family members sit by their bedside, and the priest offers comfort. It's what good Christian folk do. So, Thomas' family gathers around him. His wife bathes his head with cool water. His children huddle in the corner, scared and confused. They are doing exactly what they're supposed to do, and it is the worst possible thing they could be doing. They are exposing themselves, at close range, to a disease of unimaginable virulence. Historians often point to this community-centric nature of medieval life as one of the key reasons the plague spread so devastatingly. In an age with no concept of germ theory, compassion was a death sentence. The most pious and caring individuals, priests, nuns, and devoted family members, were often the first to get sick and the first to die, because their faith and their love compelled them to be close to the suffering. The very fabric of their society, their sense of duty and charity, became a mechanism for the plague's transmission. There's a strange and little-known aspect of the plague's arrival that modern epidemiologists find fascinating. They call it the smoldering period. For a plague to truly take hold in a new community, it needs to reach a certain threshold. A single infected flea biting one person might not be enough. The bacterium needs to find its footing, moving quietly from rat to flea, from flea to human, perhaps causing a few isolated, unexplained deaths that people might write off as a bad fever or an old ailment. This period could last for weeks. Then, once it hits a critical mass, it explodes. This is a point of academic debate. Was there a clear, single patient zero in most communities, or did the infection simmer under the surface, erupting in multiple places at once when conditions were right? As night falls, you're sitting in your own home, trying to eat your meager dinner of bread and cheese, but you can't stop listening. You're listening for sounds from next door. You hear the muffled sound of a woman's weeping, and then you hear it again. That terrible, deep cough. It sounds wetter now, more desperate. You push your food away, your appetite gone. You look at your own family, your children sleeping quietly in the corner. For the first time, your home doesn't feel safe. It feels like a fragile wooden box, and you can hear a monster scratching at the walls. The next morning, a terrifying new development unfolds. Tom's wife, her face streaked with tears and sleep-sluns, runs from her house to find the village healer, an old woman who lives at the edge of the woods. She's hysterical, talking about the swellings. The word spreads quickly. A small, morbidly curious crowd gathers at a safe distance from the blacksmith's home, whispering, "You are part of that crowd. You can't help it." The morbid curiosity is stronger than your fear. You watch as the healer, clutching a pouch of dried herbs, hesitantly enters the house. She emerges only moments later, her face ashen. She makes the sign of the cross and hurries away, refusing to speak to anyone. Later, the priest goes in. He stays longer, and when he comes out, he gathers the village elders. His voice is low but carries in the hushed silence. He confirms the rumors. Thomas, the strong blacksmith, has developed the buboes. These are the horrifying, telltale signs of the plague, the ones the pilgrim from Messina had described with such terror. Dark, grotesquely swollen lumps, some as large as an apple, have erupted in his groin and under his arms, where the body's lymph nodes are concentrated. The priest says they are hard as stone, excruciatingly painful to the touch, and have turned a sickening blackish purple color. This is the classic symptom of bubonic plague. The bacterium, Yersinia pestis, once introduced into the body by a flea bite, travels to the nearest lymph node. There, it multiplies at an astonishing rate, causing the node to swell dramatically and fill with blood and pus. This process is what creates the bubo. The name bubonic itself comes from this single, terrifying symptom. From the infected lymph node, the bacteria then spill out into the bloodstream, causing overwhelming sepsis. This leads to high fever, vomiting, and internal hemorrhaging. The bleeding under the skin is what creates the dark patches that gave the disease its other name, the Black Death. You listen to the priest's description, and a wave of nausea rolls over you. This is no longer just a fever. This is a mark, a sign from God. The priest says, a mark of sin made visible on the body. He announces there will be a special mass, that everyone must pray for deliverance. But even as he speaks of prayer, you see the flicker of raw fear in his own eyes. The day wears on. The sounds from the blacksmith's house become more harrowing. You can hear Thomas' agonized moans. punctuated by his wife's desperate prayers. By evening, a new symptom appears. Dark spulcus, like old bruises, begin to bloom all over his body. His fingertips and toes are turning black as the blood flow ceases. The healer had a folk name for these. God's tokens. They were seen as a final, divine step, a sign that death was imminent. Here's a bizarre and grim little piece of information from the era. Once the buboes appeared, some people, in a state of absolute desperation, would try to lance them themselves. They would take a knife, heat it in the fire, and try to cut the swellings open to let the poison out. This was, of course, excruciatingly painful and incredibly dangerous. It rarely worked and often led to a more rapid death from secondary infection or shock. Yet, you can almost understand the sheer panic that would lead someone to such a measure. It was an attempt to do something in the face of a foe that was completely incomprehensible. The scientific community today is still trying to understand the full spectrum of the Black Death's symptoms and their mortality rates, while the bubonic form is the most famous, with a mortality rate of around 5,070% if untreated. There were other, even deadlier variations. The pneumonic form, which infected the lungs, was nearly 100% fatal and spread person to person. The septicemic form, where the bacteria went straight into the bloodstream without even forming buboes, was also almost universally fatal, often killing within 24 hours. Historians debate how these forms interacted and which was dominant in different regions. It's possible that poor Thomas is suffering from a combination of them, a perfect storm of the disease. As dusk settles, an unnatural quiet falls over the blacksmith's house. The moaning has stopped. You're sitting in your own home, trying not to look out the window, but your eyes are drawn to it again and again. You see a flicker of candlelight through their shutters. A few minutes later, the priest leaves the house, his shoulders slumped. He doesn't need to say anything. Thomas, the laughing, booming blacksmith, is dead. He lasted less than 3 days. The fear in the village solidifies into something cold and hard. It's real, it's here, and it's fast. You look at the house next door. No longer just a neighbor's home, but a house of death. You feel a sudden, primal urge to board up your own windows, to block the chimney, to seal every crack and crevice. You pull your children closer, an irrational fear gripping you that the sickness can seep through the very walls. The story of the Black Death is no longer a story. It's a reality, and the first victim has fallen. The death of the blacksmith sends a shockwave of terror through your village. The question on everyone's lips, whispered in hushed tones, is, what do we do now? The answer, it seems, arrives on horseback a few days later. Eamon rides into the village square, dressed in a long, dark coat, his face hidden by one of the most bizarre and unsettling apparitions you have ever seen. A leather mask with a long, curved beak, like some sort of monstrous bird. Glass discs are fitted into the eye holes, giving him a blank, insect-like stare. This is a plague doctor. He doesn't come with promises of a cure. He comes with an air of grim authority and a cloud of strange, cloying smells. The beak of his mask, you learn, is not just for show. It's stuffed with aromatic herbs, spices, and flowers, things like ambergris, mint, camphor, and cloves. This is the cutting edge of 14th century medical technology, all based on a flawed but pervasive idea, the miasma theory. The leading medical minds of your time, trained in the works of Galen and Hippocrates, believe that disease is spread by miasma, or bad air. They think the pestilence is a poisonous vapor that rises from the earth, from rotting organic matter, or is exhaled by the sick. To protect oneself, one must purify the air they breathe. The doctor's bird mask is, in essence, a primitive gas mask. The fragrant herbs are meant to filter out the deadly miasma before it can enter his lungs. It's a terrifyingly logical solution to a completely wrong premise. He also carries a long wooden stick, which he uses to examine patients, poke bodies, and, importantly, keep people at a distance. The doctor is summoned to the blacksmith's house, where Thomas' wife has now fallen ill with the same fever. You watch from a distance as he enters, the strange, bird-like silhouette disappearing into the darkened doorway. He doesn't stay long. When he emerges, he speaks to the village elders in a clipped, emotional tone. He confirms it is the great pestilence. His prescribed treatment is a grim cocktail of medieval medicine. He suggests bleeding the patient to rebalance their humors. The four essential fluids of the body: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Sickness, according to this theory, is an imbalance of these humors. He also prescribes poultices to be placed on the buboes. And these aren't just herbal compresses. One of his recommended recipes involves a mixture of tree resin, roots of white lilies, and dried human excrement, all cooked up into a paste and smeared onto the swellings. Another popular, and equally useless, remedy was to take a live, healthy chicken, pluck the feathers from its backside, and strap it to the patient's bubo. The theory was that the chicken would draw the poison out of the body and into itself. When the chicken got sick, you dewash and repeat the process until either the patient or the chicken died. Spoiler alert, it was usually the chicken, and then the patient. These weren't just fringe quacks either. Many of these cures were endorsed by the medical faculty at the prestigious University of Paris. The desperation was so profound that any action felt better than no action at all. Here's a strange, counterintuitive fact about these plague doctors. They were often not first-rate physicians. Many were second-rate doctors, young physicians with limited experience, or even people with no formal medical training at all who saw a business opportunity. They were hired by towns and cities to treat the sick, count the dead, and sometimes witness wills. Their services were available to both the rich and the poor, but their track record was, to put it mildly, abysmal. The famous beaked costume itself is a bit of an anachronism. While protective clothing was used during the Black Death, the full, iconic bird-like outfit is more commonly associated with plagues in the 17th century, particularly one designed by Charles D'Ormy in 1619. However, the core principles, the miasmatheria and the use of aromatic herbs for protection, were absolutely central to the 14th century response. The image of the Birdman became a potent symbol of the plague, a harbinger of death. Regardless of the precise century it was perfected, the plague doctor gives his grim instructions, collects his fee from the village council, and prepares to leave. He offers one last piece of advice to the healthy: carry flowers or a pomander, a small bowl of fragrant spices, with you at all times. Sniff it whenever you are near the sick or pass a house of mourning. Burn juniper and ash branches inside your homes to purify the air. Avoid bathing, as open pores might allow the miasma to enter your body more easily. His advice spreads through the village, a new gospel of survival. You see people clutching bunches of herbs to their noses as they scurry through the streets. The air becomes thick with the smoke from countless household fires, a constant, hazy effuge of burning wooden wishful thinking. The doctor's visit has done nothing to stop the sickness, but it has changed something. It has replaced the community's instinct for compassion with a clinical, prescribed fear. The doctor, with his mask and his stick, has taught you not how to cure the sick, but how to distance yourself from them. He has given you rituals to perform, a way to feel like you are fighting back, even when all you are really doing is sniffing flowers and waiting for the inevitable. As he rides away, his strange silhouette shrinking against the horizon, you realize he hasn't brought a cure. He has only brought a new, more organized kind of despair. The plague doctor's visit, with his strange mask and useless advice, leaves a residue of clinical fear in the village. The old ways of community and comfort are eroding, replaced by suspicion and a desperate, clumsy attempt at self-preservation. This new reality hits you with brutal force a few days later. It starts with a cry in the middle of the night, a thin, reedy wail from the house on the other side of yours. It's the home of an elderly widow, Elodie and her daughter, Isabel. You've known them forever. Elodie often watches the village children, and Isabel helped your wife with the spinning last winter. The cry is from Isabel. You lie in the dark, your heart pounding. You know what this means. The sickness has jumped. It has passed the blacksmith's now silent house and has landed on your other doorstep. Through your thin wooden walls, you can hear Isabella's cries turned into groans of pain. And then, the sound of her mother weeping and praying. The next morning, the door to their small cottage remains shut. Later in the day, you see Elodie's face for a moment in the window. It's a mask of pure terror and exhaustion. A little while later, the door creaks open. It's Elodie. She stumbles out, her clothes disheveled, her eyes wild. She looks towards your house, then towards her other neighbors. Help me, she rests, her voice raw. For the love of God, my daughter is burning. She needs water. A year ago, this would have been an unthinkable scene. The moment she cried for help, half the village would have rushed to her side. Your wife would have already been there with a bucket of fresh well water. You would be offering to fetch the priest. But now, everyone freezes. The few people out in the street turn away, pulling their cloaks tighter, clutching their little pouches of herbs. They hurry off in the other direction, pretending not to hear. Your own front door is shut tight. You are inside, with your family. Your wife is holding your children, her back pressed against the wall, as if trying to physically distance them from the sound of Elodie's plea. You stand by the door, your hand on the heavy wooden latch. Every instinct of human decency, every lesson the priest has ever taught you about charity and loving thy neighbor, screams at you to open it, to take her a bucket of water. It's just water. But then the plague doctor's sterile, terrifying logic floods your mind. Miasma, that air, the sickness exhaled by the dying. Elodie has been in that small, sealed cottage with her sick daughter for a whole day. She is surely breathing out the pestilence with every desperate gasp. Opening your door would be like opening a floodgate, letting the poison into your home, to your family. You look at your sleeping child, their face peaceful and innocent. The fear for them is a physical thing, a cold not in your stomach. It's a fear more powerful than your sense of duty, more powerful than your pity for Elodie. It is the primal, animal instinct to protect your own blood, so you do nothing. You stand there, your hand on the latch, and you listen as Elodie's please turn to sobs, and then to curses. You hear her call out the names of her neighbors, your name, accusing you all of being heartless cowards. And she's right, you are a coward, but you are a living coward with a healthy family. And in this new world, that feels like the only victory that matters. After what feels like an eternity, you hear her stumble back inside, the door to her cottage slamming shut. Silence returns, a heavy, guilty silence. This was the great tragedy of the Black Death, a social and moral collapse that ran in parallel with the biological one. The chronicles of the time are filled with harrowing accounts of this breakdown. The Florentine writer Boccaccio, in his famous work The Decameron, wrote with grim clarity, "This terror caused such shrinking of the heart in men and women that brother forsook brother, uncle nephew, and sister brother, and very often wife or husband. Nay, what is more, and scarcely to be believed, fathers and mothers were found to abandon their own children, untended, unvisited, to their fate. What you have just done, choosing fear over compassion, is happening in every house, on every street, in every city touched by the plague. It's the unraveling of the very threads that hold a society together. One little known and heartbreaking consequence of this was what happened to the children, with adults dying so quickly, or abandoning their sick families. Vast numbers of orphans were created overnight. In a world with no formal foster care system, these children were often left to fend for themselves, dying not just from the plague, but from starvation and neglect in the empty houses of their parents. Historians still debate the extent and uniformity of this social breakdown. Some argue that while the accounts of Boccaccio are powerful, they might represent the worst-case scenarios in densely populated cities like Florence. They point to evidence from some village records and wills that suggests family ties and community support, while severely strained, did not completely vanish everywhere. There were still acts of incredible bravery and compassion, priests who stayed with their flock, and family members who nursed their kin to the bitter end. But for you, in this moment, crouched in your home, The academic debate means nothing. You have failed the test. You have chosen survival over your own humanity. You slide the heavy wooden bar across your door. It makes a solid, definitive sound, a sound that locks you in, but also locks Elodie and the entire suffering world out. You have made your choice. You have walled yourself into your own little fortress of fear, and you will have to live with the silence from next door. Days turn into a week. The sounds from Elodia's cottage next door have long since faded into an unnerving silence. No one goes in. No one comes out. The house just sits there, a sealed tomb. Your own home has become a prison. You only venture out for the most essential tasks, like fetching water from the well, the quick, heart-pounding dash, holding your breath as if the air itself is a toxic soup. The single, most defining sound of your world becomes the church bell. At first, it tolls for each death. It rang for Thomas the blacksmith. A few days later, it rang for his wife, then for their eldest son. It rings for the old weaver at the end of the lane. It rings for the baker's young apprentice. Each peal is a stark, public announcement of the plague's relentless march through your village. Ding, dong, another soul departed. Ding, dong, another family shattered. The sound is constant, a morbid rhythm that underscores every moment of your day. You find yourself counting the tolls, trying to guess who has fallen now. It's a sound that promises no comfort, no salvation. It is simply a scoreboard for the dead. The sky might be clear, the birds might be singing, but the air is always heavy with the clang of doom. Then, a new, more terrifying phase begins. The deaths start coming too fast. The priest and the few brave men who help him can no longer keep up with individual burials. The tradition of a proper Christian funeral, a procession, a mass, a carefully dug grave in the consecrated ground of the churchyard, becomes an impossible luxury. They start digging a large pit at the edge of the village, a plague pit. The cart comes now. Instead of the bell, a rickety wooden cart, pulled by a gaunt-looking man whose face is perpetually shadowed by a cowl. He moves through the village streets at dawn and at dusk. His voice a monotone cry. Bring out your dead. It's a sound that chills you to the bone. And you see people obey. You peek through a crack in your shutters and see him and drag a body wrapped in a sheet out of his hole, heaving it onto the growing pile in the cart. He doesn't weep. His face is a blank mask of exhaustion and despair. This is the new reality. There is no time for grief. There is only the grim, practical need to get the dead out of the house. One evening, the cart stops outside Elodie's silent cottage. Two men, their faces wrapped in vinegar-soaked cloths, force the door open. The smell that wafts out, even from your sealed house, is foul and sweetened, makes you gag. They emerge moments later, carrying two bundles wrapped in blankets. One is larger, one is smaller. Elodie and Isabel. They are tossed onto the cart with the others. The cart creaks away, its grim cargo jostling with the rutted road. And then, one Tuesday, the bell stops, just like that. The silence it leaves behind is somehow more terrifying than the constant tolling. You wait, listening for the familiar sound, but it doesn't come. The day passes in an eerie quiet. You learn later from a neighbor, shouted across the street, that the priest is dead. The men who helped with the burials are dead. The man who rang the bell is dead. There is no one left to toll it. The silence of the bell marks a profound turning point. It's not just that the official record of death has ceased. It's that the institution that provided structure, comfort, and meaning to your world has collapsed. The church was the center of medieval life. It marked the hours of the day, the seasons of the year, and the stages of life from baptism to last rites. Now, the church doors are closed. There is no one to hear confession, no one to offer communion, no one to give the dead their final blessing. God, it seems, has fallen silent. This clerical crisis was one of the most significant long-term consequences of the Black Death. The church lost an enormous percentage of its clergy, particularly the dedicated local priests who stayed to minister to the sick. Historians argue that this had a huge impact on the church's authority and prestige. In the aftermath, they had to recruit replacements quickly, often lowering their standards for education and moral character. This influx of less qualified clergy may have contributed to the growing dissatisfaction with the church that would eventually fuel the Protestant Reformation a century and a half later. Here's a small, grim detail about the plague pits. As the crisis deepened, the living were often too weak or too few to dig them deep enough. Bodies were piled in layers, like Lasonia, as one chronicler morbidly put it, with a thin layer of earth separating them. The sheer scale is hard to comprehend. In cities like London, archaeologists have uncovered mass graves containing thousands of skeletons, all aligned in neat rows, a testament to a system that tried to maintain order and dignity, even in the face of overwhelming chaos. Until it broke down, the silence stretches. Without the bell, time itself feels warped and broken. You no longer know how many have died today. Is it 5? Is it 10? Is the plague getting worse or is it fading? The absence of the bell is the absence of information, the absence of order. It's the sound of your world officially coming undone. You are completely on your own now. There is no authority to appeal to, no ritual to provide comfort. There is only the silence, the cold, and the terrifying, unanswered question, who will be next? The silence of the church bell becomes your new reality. Your village, once a close-knit community, is now a collection of isolated, terrified households. The fear inside your small home is a palpable thing, thick as smoke. The temptation to flee, to simply run, becomes overwhelming. Surely, it can't be this bad everywhere. Surely, there is some safe haven, some corner of the world that God has spared. One morning, before the sun is fully up, you make the decision. You can't stay here and wait for the sickness to seep through your door. You pack a small bundle of bread, cheese, and a water skin. You wake your wife and children, your hands shaking as you try to explain. You tell them you're going to head for the countryside. The air is cleaner there. You argue, echoing the plague doctor's flawed logic. Fewer people means less miasma. You'll head for the hills, find an abandoned cottage, maybe live off the land. It's a desperate, half-formed plan, but it's better than doing nothing. It's a plan born of motion. The belief that movement itself is a form of defense. You crack open your door and peer out. The street is empty, shrouded in a gray morning mist. It looks like the end of the world. You shepherd your family out, pulling your cloaks tight. Then you start walking, trying not to look at the houses with the crude excess painted on their doors. A warning that the plague is inside. You are not alone in this impulse. All across Europe, cities and villages are emptying out. The roads are filled with refugees. A frantic, desperate migration of people trying to outrun an invisible enemy. The wealthy were the first to go. Of course, they had country estates to retreat to, the resources to pack up their households and leave at the first sign of trouble. But now, people like you, with nothing but the clothes on your back, are joining the exodus. As you get out onto the main track leading away from the village, you see the true scale of it. The road is dotted with other families, all with the same haunted, determined look in their eyes. They trudge along in silence, avoiding eye contact, each family an island of suspicion. No one shares food. No one offers a kind word. To meet another person on the road is not a comfort, but a threat. Are they sick? Are they carrying the pestilence? The social fabric of the road is as tattered as that of the village you just left. You quickly learn that the countryside is no paradise. The first village you approach, a small hamlet nestled in a valley, has set up a crude barricade at its entrance. Two men with pitchforks stand guard. They yell at you to stay back, that their village is clean and they won't let any outsiders in, especially not from a known plague town like yours. They look at you not as a fellow human in need, but as a vessel of disease. You are turned away, with curses and threats shouted at your back. This scene was repeated everywhere. Healthy communities, in a desperate act of self-preservation, would cut themselves off entirely. They created a patchwork of localized, brutal quarantines. This fear of travelers even led to the spread of some truly bizarre rumors. One popular story was that the plague was being intentionally spread by unto our eye, or anointers, malevolent individuals who would smear a magical, Disease, written ointment on doors and church benches. This paranoia led to the persecution and murder of countless innocent travelers and foreigners. As you press on, deeper into the countryside, you see that the dream of an untouched rural idyll is a fantasy. You pass abandoned farmhouses, the doors swinging open, the fields half plowed. You see livestock wandering aimlessly, their owners dead or fled. The plague, you realize with a sinking heart, does not respect the boundaries between town and country. The rats and fleas that carry it are just as happy in a thatched barn as they are in a city cellar. Historians have long debated the geographic distribution of the plague and the effectiveness of flight. While it's true that some isolated rural areas and mountainous regions saw lower mortality rates, flight was by no means a guarantee of safety. In fact, the mass movement of people was one of the key mechanisms that spread the disease. Refugees from an infected town would carry the plague with them to the next, setting off a new chain of infection. Your very act of trying to save your family could be the thing that condemns another village. The logic is inescapable. You can't outrun a fire when you are carrying one of the embers. A little known fact is that some people didn't just flee to the countryside. They took to the water. People with access to boats would anchor them in the middle of rivers or lakes, trying to create a mode of safety around themselves. For a while, this might have worked, but eventually, they would have to come ashore for supplies, risking exposure all over again. Night falls. You and your family huddle together in the cold, hiding in a thicket of trees just off the road. You eat a piece of your stale bread, which tastes like dust and despair. Your children are cold and scared. Your wife looks at you, her eyes asking a question you cannot answer. What have you done? You lead them from the prison of your home into the wilderness of a collapsing world. You look back in the direction of your village. You can't see it, but you imagine it sitting in the darkness, sick and dying. Then you look forward, down the unfamiliar road, into more darkness. You have escaped, but you are not safe. You are simply lost. You are a refugee in your own country, and there is nowhere left to run. Days of aimless wandering blend into a miserable blur. Your desperate flight to the countryside has proven to be a failure. Every village is hostile, every road fraught with suspicion. Your small supply of food is gone. Your children are weak with hunger, their whimpers a constant, heartbreaking sound. You have traded the fear of plague for the certainty of starvation. Defeated, you make the agonizing decision to turn back. Your home, the place you fled in terror, is now the only shelter you can think of. You pray it's still empty, that no one has broken in to scavenge, that it has been marked with the dreaded X. As you trudge back towards your village, you notice people behaving strangely. You see a man walking towards you on the road, and as he gets closer, you see HES holding a small bunch of wilting flowers and herbs to his nose, sniffing it with a frantic, rhythmic intensity. In the next hamlet you pass from a safe distance, you see children playing a grim game in a circle, chanting a little rhyme before all falling to the ground in a heap. You have stumbled upon the folk medicine of the masses. In the absence of real cures, people clung to rituals and superstitions, desperate for any sense of control. The most prevalent of these was the belief, encouraged by the plague doctors, that pleasant smells could ward off the bad air. This gave rise to the pomander, a small metal bowl filled with spices, and for the less wealthy, a simple tussi masai or nosage, a small bouquet of fragrant herbs and flowers. People would walk around with their faces buried in these little bundles, a fragile, fragrant shield against a deadly miasma. It's this practice that many believe gave rise to the famous nursery rhyme, Ring-a ring o roses. The theory, though debated by folklorists, is that the rhyme is a direct description of the plague. Ring-a ring o roses refers to the red, ring-like rash that sometimes appeared on the skin. A pocketful of posies describes the herbs people carried to ward off the smell and the disease. Adii shu mimics the sneezing fits that could signal the onset of the pneumonic form of the plague. And the final line, we all fall down, is brutally literal. It's a game of death, played by children in the shadow of the real thing. When you finally limp back into your own village, The change is palpable. The air, which you remembered as being thick with wood smoke from the purifying fires, now has a different smell. It's a cloying, sweet-smelling fog. People are burning incense, lavender, and rosemary in the streets. Every person you see is clutching a bunch of herbs. The world has become a garden of denial. You and your family, dirty and starving, are a stark contrast to this fragrant masquerade. A woman scuttles away from you, shielding her face with a bunch of roses, as if you were the embodiment of the plague itself. The irony is bitter. You fled to find clean air and have returned to a village trying to perfume its own death. One of the more peculiar and less known aromatic cures people turned to was living in close proximity to smelly animals. Some physicians advised people to keep goats or other livestock inside their houses, believing the powerful stench of the animals would overwhelm and drive away the weaker, more pestilential miasma. One can only imagine the state of a medieval cottage, already cramped and smoky, with a goat added to the mix. It's a testament to the level of desperation that this seemed like a reasonable course of action. The academic debate here centers on whether rhymes, like ring-a-ring-o' roses, truly date back to the 14th century. Many folklorists argue that there's no written record of the rhyme until the 18th and 19th centuries, and its connection to the Black Death might be a more modern, romanticized invention. They suggest the symptoms described are vague and could apply to many diseases. However, the core practices, the pocketful of posies and the fear of miasma, are undeniably rooted in the plague years. Whether the rhyme is a direct relate or echo, it captures the essence of the folk response to the pandemic. The blend of childlike ritual and profound, underlying terror. You manage to get back to your house. It's untouched. You bar the door, and your family collapses in sheer exhaustion. The relief of being home is immense, but it's tinged with failure. You have discovered the terrible truth. There is no escape. The world outside is just as sick and scared as the world in your village. Your frantic journey has only served to weaken you and your family, making you more vulnerable than before. You look at the small bunch of wilting daisies your youngest child is still clutching, picked from the roadside on your journey. It's a pathetic, useless thing, yet, in this moment, you understand the impulse. You go to the small herb patch in your back garden and pick a few sprigs of mitten thyme. You crush them in your hand, raising them to your nose. The sharp, clean scent does nothing to fight disease, but for a fleeting second, it masks the smell of fear and decay. It's a lie, but it's a comforting one. You are no longer running. You are now joining the rest of your village in their fragrant, hopeless vigil, huddled in your home, surrounded by a village steeped in the fragrance of fear. You find yourself caught in the crosscurrents of a desperate, village-wide debate, with the priest gone and the plague doctor's remedies proving useless. People are searching for a grander explanation. Why is this happening? Who is to blame? The arguments take place in hushed, fearful conversations over garden walls or in quick, furtive exchanges at the well. Two main theories begin to dominate the terrified public consciousness. The first, and most pervasive, is the one the church has taught you your entire life. This is the wrath of God. It is a divine punishment for the sins of mankind. Preachers and prophets, both real and self-proclaimed, had been warning of this for years. They spoke of the world's growing wickedness, the greed of merchants, the vanity of women, the corruption within the church itself. Now, the day of reckoning has arrived. The plague is a second great flood, but this time, God is using pestilence instead of water to cleanse the earth of the wicked. This belief is everywhere. You hear people confessing their sins aloud in the streets, begging for a forgiveness that seems unattainable. They scrutinize every past misfortune, every natural phenomenon, for signs of God's displeasure. Do you remember the earthquake that struck Italy a few months ago? They signed the strange alignment of the planets last year. A clear warning, the swarm of locusts that devoured the crops in the next valley over. God's judgment, made manifest. This worldview offers a strange kind of comfort. It gives the chaos a purpose. It's terrifying, but it's not random. If it's a punishment from God, then perhaps, just perhaps, it can be stopped through piety, prayer, and repentance. But a second, more sinister theory is gaining traction. This one bubbles up from a deeper, more primal well of fear and suspicion. It dismisses the divine explanation in favor of a human one. This is not God's work, some people whisper. This is a deliberate act of evil. Someone is poisoning the wells. They are smearing a deadly concoction on doorknobs and church pews. The bad air, the miasma, isn't rising from the earth. It's being created, concocted by malicious men. This theory is, in many ways, even more frightening, because it gives the enemy a human face. But it's also more empowering, because a human enemy can be fought. A human enemy can be found and punished. Your fear, which was a vast, amorphous cloud of dread, can now be focused into a sharp point of rage. The poisoned wells narrative became one of the most dangerous and deadly conspiracy theories of the Middle Ages. It was a rumor that spread almost as fast as the plague itself, offering a simple answer to a complex problem, and it quickly found a target. You recount to one of those points where historians are still trying to unravel the tangled web of medieval belief. Was the wrath of God theory a genuine, deeply held theological conviction for most people? Or was it the official explanation that they felt compelled to accept? And did the poisoned wells theory arise spontaneously from public panic? Or was it actively encouraged by certain authorities who found it useful to redirect the populace's anger away from their own failed leadership? It's likely a complex mix of both. The human mind craves agency and explanation, and in the face of something as incomprehensible as the plague, any explanation can feel better than none at all. What if the lesser known, and frankly bizarre, explanations that circulated at the time combined both natural and supernatural elements? Learned scholars at the University of Paris, after a formal inquiry, released a report in 1348. They concluded that the plague was caused by a specific and unfortunate astrological event, a triple conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in the house of Aquarius. This conjunction, they argued, drew up evil vapors from the earth and the sea, creating the pestilential air. It's a perfect example of the medieval mindset, blending cutting-edge astronomical observation with ancient beliefs about cosmic influence. To them, it wasn't superstition, it was science. You find yourself torn when you lie awake at night, listening to the unnerving silence of the village. The wrath of God theory feels right. You mentally catalog your own sins, your own petty grievances and moments of weakness, and wonder if they are part of the great weight of wickedness that is sinking the world. But during the day, when you see the fear and anger in your neighbor's eyes, the idea of a poisoner, a tangible villain, is seductively simple. It's easier to hate a person than to feel abandoned by God. This debate isn't just a philosophical exercise. It has real-world consequences. The wrath of God camp begins to explore more extreme forms of penance, seeking a way to appease their angry deity. The poisoned wells camp begins to look around for a scapegoat, their eyes scanning the community for anyone who is different, anyone who could be blamed. The village is an tinderbox of fear and grief. These two theories are the sparks, and you have no idea which one will ignite the fire first. The great debate in your village between God's wrath and poisoned wells doesn't remain a debate for long. The tension finally snaps, and one of the theories erupts into a terrifying public spectacle. One afternoon, a strange procession enters the village. At first, you hear a faint, rhythmic chanting from down the road, punctuated by a sound you can't quite place. A sharp, wet, slapping noise. You peer through a crack in your shutters, and what you see makes your blood run cold. A column of people, perhaps 30 or 40 of them, is marching slowly down the main street. They are stripped to the waist, their backs a horrifying crisscross of bloody welts. Each person holds a heavy leather scourge, tipped with iron studs, and in a synchronized, hypnotic rhythm, they swing the scourges over their shoulders, bringing them down hard upon their own backs. Swing, slap, swing, slap. With each blow, they cry out in a mixture of pain and religious ecstasy. This is a procession of flagella and tias. They are the most extreme adherents of the wrath of God theory. They believe that the plague is a divine punishment that the only way to appease God's anger is through extreme public penance. They travel from town to town, a mobile theater of suffering, hoping their self-inflicted agony will serve as a vicarious atonement for the sins of the world. The procession stops in the deserted market square. The leader, a man with a wild, messianic look in his eyes, begins to preach in a booming voice. He speaks of the apocalypse, of the sins of the clergy, of the imminent end of the world. He reads from a letter he claims was delivered by an angel, a letter that prescribes their ritual of public flagellation as the only path to salvation. Then, the ritual begins in earnest. They form a large circle, continuing their rhythmic whipping. Some fall to the ground, writhing in agony, while others chant hymns, their voices strained. It's a hypnotic, deeply unsettling performance. A few of your fellow villagers, desperate for any hope, any solution, are drawn out of their homes. They watch, mesmerized. Some weep. A young man from the village, whose entire family was taken by the plague last week, tears off his shirt and stumbles into the circle, taking up the bloody rhythm. He has found his answer. The flagellante movement was a real and widespread phenomenon during the Black Death. It initially arose in Germany and spread across Northern Europe. For a brief period, they were seen by the populace as holy men, heroes of faith. When a band of flagellantes arrived, they were often greeted with the ringing of church bells in towns that still had someone to ring them, and the local people would provide them with food and shelter. The flagellantes had a strict hierarchy and a set of rules. They were supposed to travel for 33.5 days, representing the years of Christ's life, and were forbidden from speaking to women or bathing. However, the movement quickly became a problem for the established church. The flagellantes were, in essence, a rogue religious movement. Their leaders claimed direct authority from God, bypassing the traditional clergy. They performed their own rituals, heard confessions, and granted absolution from sin, all of which were the sole prerogative of the church. This was a direct challenge to the Pope's authority. Here's a peculiar and often overlooked detail. The flagellantes had their own anthem. They would sing haunting hymns called Geistler Lieder as they marched and performed their rituals. These songs were powerful propaganda, spreading their ideology and attracting new followers. The music was often simple, memorable, and deeply emotional, perfectly designed to captivate a terrified and grief-stricken populace. The academic world still discusses the true nature of the flagellante movement. Were they genuinely pious individuals driven to extreme acts by overwhelming faith and fear? Or was it a form of mass hysteria, a psychological contagion that spread alongside the biological one? Some historians also point out that the movement offered a sense of empowerment and community to people who felt completely helpless. In a world where their lives were at the mercy of an invisible killer, the act of flagellation, of choosing to inflict pain on oneself, was a radical, desperate attempt to reclaim some form of control. You watch the bloody spectacle in the square, feeling not piety, but a deep sense of dread. There is something unhinged in their devotion, something dangerous. Their certainty is as terrifying as the plague itself. As evening falls, the flagellantes conclude their ritual. The leader announces that their presence has purified the village. They have taken your sins upon their own backs, but they have also brought something else. This large group, traveling from town to town, sleeping in close quarters, and interacting with desperate crowds, was a perfect vector for spreading the disease. Their ritual, which involved open, bleeding wounds, was horribly unhygienic. In their quest to stop a divine punishment, the flagellantes, in a tragic, terrible irony, were very likely helping to spread the plague themselves. They leave the next morning, taking a few new local recruits with them. The village is left in a state of stunned, uneasy silence. A few people claim to feel a new sense of hope. But you are left with the image of their blood on the cobblestones and the chilling realization that people's search for a cure might be just as dangerous as the disease itself. The flagellantes depart, leaving behind a strange cocktail of hope and unease. For a few days, a quiet solemnity hangs over the village. People pray with renewed fervor, clinging to the hope that the bloody spectacle they witnessed has somehow cleansed them. But the plague is indifferent to prayer and penance. A week later, the cart is making its rounds again, and the illusion of salvation shatters. The next blow falls on the person who was supposed to be the village's last bastion of faith, the new priest. He was a young, earnest man, sent from a nearby monastery to replace the one who had died. He had been tireless, going from house to house, offering what comfort and last rites he could. His faith a brave, if fragile, shield against the encroaching darkness. Then, one Sunday, the church doors remained closed. The bell, which he had begun to ring again, falls silent once more. People gather at a distance, murmuring. Finally, a village elder, his face grim, emerges from the small house behind the church where the priest live. He makes a terse announcement. The priest has the fever. The news hits the community like a physical blow. The death of the first priest was a tragedy. The sickness of the second feels like a verdict. It's a direct refutation of the idea that piety offers protection. This man was the most devout among you. He spent his days in prayer. He lived a Spartan life. He walked into the homes of the sick when everyone else fled. If he was not safe, then who could be? It feels like God has not just abandoned you, but is actively mocking your faith. A few days later, the priest dies. He dies alone. No one dares to enter his home to offer him comfort, just as he had offered it to so many others. The ultimate symbol of the community as spiritual life is now just another sealed house, another source of terror. This event marks the final, complete collapse of the religious and social order. With no priest, there are no more sacraments. There is no baptism for newborns, no mass to mark the week, and most importantly, no last rites for the dying. For the people of your time, dying without a final confession and absolution is a terrifying prospect. It means facing God's judgment with the full weight of your sins upon your soul, risking eternal damnation. Now, families are forced to handle the final moments themselves. You hear stories. A son, weeping, trying to remember the Latin prayers to say over his dying father. A woman using water from the well to make the sign of the cross on her child's forehead. A desperate, makeshift baptism. These are acts of profound love and faith, but in the eyes of the church, they are unsanctioned and illegitimate. This is where you witness the birth of what historians call lay piety. When the official institution of the church failed, people's faith didn't just vanish. It went private. It moved from the church sanctuary into the family home. People began to develop their own rituals, to rely on their own direct relationship with God. Because the intermediaries were gone, this shift had enormous long-term consequences, planting a seed of religious individualism that would blossom during the Reformation. A strange and little-known consequence of the death of so many clergy was its effect on the written record. Monks and priests were the primary chroniclers and scribes of the medieval world. With so many of them dying, the keeping of records simply stopped in many places. There are literal gaps in the historical account. Years where town records, monastic chronicles, and financial ledgers just go blank. It's as if the plague was so overwhelming. It even killed history itself for a time. Historians still debate the true psychological impact of this clerical collapse. Did it, as some argue, lead to a widespread crisis of faith and a more cynical, secular worldview, or did it, as others contend, actually deepen personal religiosity by forcing people to take their faith into their own hands? The answer is likely both. You can see it in your village. Some people fall into a deep, nihilistic despair, convinced that God is dead or has turned his back on them completely. They turn to drink or indulge in a grim, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die philosophy. Others, however, become more intensely devout than ever, their private prayers filled with a new urgency and intimacy. You are now living in a world without spiritual authority. The rituals that have guided your life and the lives of your ancestors for centuries have evaporated. When your neighbor's infant dies of the fever, you watch from your window as the father carries the tiny, blanket-wrapped bundle out to the edge of the woods at dusk. He digs a small, shallow grave with his own hands under an old oak tree. He stands there for a long time, his head bowed. There is no priest, no prayer book, no holy ground. There is only a father, his silent grief, and the vast, uncaring silence of the sky. This is the new funeral. This is the new faith, a faith of solitude and sorrow. With the church silent and God seemingly absent, the simmering paranoia of the poisoned wells theory finally boils over. The village's fear, untethered from any religious framework, needs a new target. It needs a scapegoat, and in the twisted logic of terror, the most obvious target is always the outsider. For years, a small Jewish family has lived on the outskirts of your village. They are moneylenders and traders, living a life mostly separate from the Christian community. You've had dealings with them before. You borrowed money from the father, Jacob, 2 winters ago to buy seed after a bad harvest. He charged you interest, which the church forbids, but everyone needs. Then you paid him back. His wife, Leah, sometimes sells rare spices and dyes in the market. You don't know them well. They keep to themselves. They have their own customs, their own prayers in a language you don't understand. They are, in a word, different, and now their difference has become a death sentence. The whispers start, insidious and quick. Why aren't they dying at the same rate as everyone else? This was often a false perception, but a powerful one. Their houses are so clean. It's unnatural. They have secret knowledge, ancient texts. It's a small leap in the terrified mind from different to diabolical. The rumor that has been sweeping across Europe, that an international Jewish conspiracy is poisoning Christian wells to destroy Christendom, finds fertile ground in your village's grief and rage. It culminates one evening. A mob gathers in the market square, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of torches. They are led by a man whose family was wiped out by the plague. His grief has curdled into a murderous rage. He shouts the accusations. He claims he saw Jacob sneaking away from the village well late one night. Another man chimes in, saying Leah sold him an herbal remedy that made his goat sick. The stories are flimsy, contradictory, but it doesn't matter. The mob isn't interested in proof. It's interested in catharsis. They need to punish someone. You watch from the shadows, your heart pounding. You know Jacob. You know he is just a man, not a demon. But to speak up now would be suicide. The mob's fear has made them a single, unthinking beast. To stand in its way is to be devoured. They march towards the family's house, their shouts echoing in the night. Poisoneress, killers, Christ killers. The old, ugly slurs are dredged up and weaponized. They smash down the door and drag the family out. Jacob, Leah, and their 2 young children. The family pleads for their lives, swearing their innocence on their holy books. Their pleas are met with curses and stones. The scene is brutal and swift. The mob, in its collective madness, falls upon the family. It is a desperate, horrific act of misplaced vengeance. By murdering this innocent family, the villagers feel they are finally fighting back against the plague. They are cleansing their community, not with prayer, but with blood. This was not an isolated incident. Across the Rhine Valley, in Switzerland, France, and Germany, thousands of Jews were massacred in 1348 and 1349. Entire communities were wiped out. In some cities, like Strasbourg, the Jewish population was rounded up and burned alive en masse, even before the plague had arrived. Based solely on the rumor of their guilt, the authorities, in many cases, either encouraged the violence or were powerless to stop it. Pope Clement VI actually issued 2 papal bulls, or decrees, declaring the Jews innocent of the poisoning charges and threatening the persecutors with excommunication. He argued, with cold logic, that the plague was also killing Jews, and was raging in lands where no Jews lived. But his pleas for reason were largely ignored, drowned out by the roar of popular hysteria. One of the strange, tragic ironies of the accusations against Jewish communities was their supposed immunity. While their death rates were likely comparable to their Christian neighbors, some historians have speculated that in certain ghettos, Jewish ritual laws may have offered a slight, accidental protection For instance, Talmudic laws that mandate washing hands before meals and after funerals, and that require a water source to be moving or letting water, might have inadvertently reduced the transmission of germs. This very cleanliness, however, was twisted by their accusers into proof of guilt, a sign of their sinister, otherworldly nature. The academic community still debates the root causes of these pogroms. Were they purely a spontaneous outburst of plague-induced panic? Or was the plague simply a convenient excuse to unleash centuries of pre-existing anti-Semitic hatred, often stoked by economic resentment over money lending? The answer is almost certainly a grim combination of both. The plague provided the spark, but the powder keg of prejudice had been sitting there for a very long time. After the mob disperses, an unnatural quiet falls over the village. The perpetrators slink back to their homes, the torchlight extinguished, leaving the broken bodies in the dark. There is no sense of victory, no feeling of relief. The air doesn't feel cleaner. The fear of the plague has not receded. It is now just layered with a new, sickening shame. You look at your own hands. You did nothing. You said nothing. You were a silent accomplice. The village didn't just kill a family tonight. It killed a piece of its own soul. The horrific violence of the previous night leaves a stain on the village. The catharsis the mob sought never came, and the plague continues its grim work, unabated. A sense of profound hopelessness settles in. You feel trapped in a dying world, a tiny, infected island in a sea of pestilence. But then, a glimmer of a different kind of story reaches you. A traveling friar, one of the few brave enough to still be on the roads, passes through the village, HES heading north, and he brings with him astonishing news. He speaks of entire regions that seem to have been spared the worst of the plague. He talks of the kingdom of Poland, under King Casimir the Great, where the death toll is said to be dramatically lower than in the rest of Europe. He also mentions isolated, remote pockets, like the Basque territories in the Pyrenees Mountains and the city of Milan, which seem to have miraculously dodged the full force of the storm. For the first time in months, you are hearing not a story of death, but a story of survival. The friar's words paint a picture of a world map that isn't just a uniform sheet of black. It has spots of light, islands of safety. The news is electrifying. Why then? What did they do differently? The friar offers the popular explanation for Poland's good fortune. King Casimir welcomed the Jewish refugees who were fleeing the massacres in Germany because they were God's chosen people in a different sense. Their presence brought divine protection to the kingdom. It's a beautifully ironic story, suggesting that the very people being blamed and murdered for the plague in your part of the world were the source of salvation elsewhere. The story of Milan is different, more brutal. The friar tells you that when the first few cases of plague appeared there, the city's ruler, Lucino Visconti, took immediate and ruthless action. He ordered the houses of the first victims to be completely walled up, with the sick, their families, and any visitors inside. Healthy or not, they were all sealed in, left to die. It was a terrifyingly effective and utterly merciless form of quarantine. This news sparks a new wave of debate and wonder in your depleted village. Could it be true? Are there really places that have survived? And what does it mean? Historians to this day are fascinated by these plague-free zones and are still arguing about the reasons behind them. The case of Poland is particularly complex. The story about King Casimir's welcome to the Jews being the reason for their salvation is a powerful myth, but the reality is likely more mundane. Poland was more sparsely populated than Western Europe, with fewer large, crowded cities and less international trade, giving the plague fewer opportunities to spread. Their relative isolation was their best defense. The case of Milan is a stark example of the effectiveness of brutal public health measures. Visconti's decision to wall up houses was inhumane, but it may have successfully broken the chain of transmission early on. It's a chilling historical lesson. Sometimes, the most draconian measures are the most effective. However, some historians question if Milan's success was as complete as the stories claim. or if the rulers simply did a better job of suppressing the bad news. And then there's the truly strange case of Nuremberg, Germany, which also reported significantly fewer deaths. One prevailing theory for this is pure dumb luck of geography and trade routes. The main commercial arteries of the time simply bypassed it. It was a backwater, and in 1348, being a backwater was the best thing you could be. A less-known survivor story is that of the small village of Ayham in England, though this happened during a later plague outbreak in the 17th century. When the plague arrived in their village via the parcel of cloth from London, the villagers, led by their rector, made the heroic and extraordinary decision to quarantine themselves entirely. They cut themselves off from the outside world to prevent the disease from spreading to the surrounding countryside. The death toll within the village was catastrophic, but they saved the region. It's a powerful counter-narrative to the stories of flight and social breakdown. This discussion of safe havens is, for you, a purely academic one. You are not in Poland or Milan. You are here, in your dying village. But the knowledge that survival is possible, that the entire world isn't doomed, is a powerful psychological shift. It introduces a new element into the emotional landscape, envy, and a tiny, flickering spark of hope. You find yourself daydreaming about what life must be like in these blessed lands. Do they still hear church bells? Do neighbors still greet each other in the street? Do children play games that don't end with everyone falling down dead? The stories of these survivor islands make your own reality feel even more grim by contrast. They are a reminder of the normal world that has been stolen from you. The friar moves on, leaving these seeds of wonder behind. The knowledge that some places were spared doesn't change your material reality, but it changes your mental one. The plague is no longer a universal, inescapable apocalypse. It is, perhaps, a conquerable foe. It has weaknesses. It can be outsmarted, or rolled out, or simply avoided. This small, fragile idea is the first step away from pure terror and towards a future where one might begin to think about how to rebuild. But first, you have to survive the present. The stories of distant, safe lands are a fleeting mental escape, but the reality of your life remains stark and dangerous. The plague has been a constant presence for months now, a monster stalking the edges of your existence. You have been lucky, incredibly, terrifyingly lucky. While your neighbors and friends have fallen, your own small household has remained untouched. You've become obsessively careful, boiling your water, staying indoors, speaking to no one. You have done everything you can, but your luck is about to run out. It begins with a shiver, a sudden, violent tremor that runs through your body, completely unrelated to the temperature in the room. You try to dismiss it. It's just a chill. You've been cold and hungry for months, but this is different. It's a deep, internal cold, a coldness in your bones that no blanket can warm. You huddle by the hearth, but the fire seems to give off no heat. Then comes the headache. It starts as a dull ache behind your eyes and quickly blossoms into a relentless, pounding agony. It feels as if someone is hammering on the inside of your skull. Light hurts. Sound hurts. The concerned whispers of your wife feel like a physical assault. Soon after, a wave of nausea crashes over you. You stumble outside and retch, but there's nothing in your stomach to bring up. It's just dry, painful heaving. The world begins to tilt and swim around you. You feel profoundly weak, as if all the strength has been siphoned out of your limbs. You can barely make it back inside, leaning heavily on the doorframe. Your wife looks at you, her face a mask of dawning horror. She knows. You know, these are not the symptoms of a common cold or a simple fever. This is the precise sequence of events you've heard described 100 times. This is how it began for Thomas the blacksmith. This is how it began for the priest. The monster you've been hiding from has finally found its way inside. It's inside you. The denial is ferocious. It's just a fever. You stammer to your wife, your teeth chattering uncontrollably. They'll be fine by morning. But you can see in her eyes that she doesn't believe you. And in your own heart, you don't believe it either. This is the moment of truth. All the social breakdown you've witnessed from a distance is now your own intimate, domestic crisis. Will your wife abandon you? As Boccaccio wrote, Will she lock you in the room and flee with the children? A brutal act of self-preservation, or will love and duty compel her to stay, to care for you, and in doing so, risk her own life and the lives of your children? The initial symptoms of the plague were notoriously swift and brutal. The period between exposure and the first signs of illness could be anywhere from 2 to 8 days. But once the symptoms began, the decline was terrifyingly rapid. The high fever, often reaching 105 degrees Fahrenheit 41, caused extreme delirium. Patients would become confused, agitated, and sometimes experience vivid, terrifying hallucinations. They would speak to people who weren't there, thrash about wildly, or babbled incoherently. This delirium was one of the most frightening aspects for family members, as their loved one would transform into a wild, unrecognizable stranger before their eyes. Here's a small, grim detail about the disease's progression. The bacterium, Yersinia pestis, produces a suite of toxins that essentially dismantle the body's defenses. It prevents immune cells from communicating with each other. It triggers massive inflammation, and it causes the breakdown of blood vessels, leading to the internal bleeding that characterized the Black Death. You are, in essence, being systematically taken apart from the inside by an invading microscopic army. The academic debate about the initial symptoms is a subtle one. Some researchers, analyzing medieval accounts, have argued that the version of Yersinia pestis that caused the Black Death might have been a different, more virulent strain than the one that exists today. They point to the incredible speed of its spread and the high mortality rates, even for the bubonic form, suggesting it might have had different properties. Genetic analysis of DNA, recovered from 14th century plague pits, has largely confirmed it is the same bacterium, but the question of whether a specific cofactor or a unique mutation made it so uniquely devastating is still a topic of scientific inquiry. Night falls, the shivering becomes uncontrollable, the fever takes hold, and the world begins to dissolve into a surreal, fiery haze. Your thoughts become fragmented and strange. You are no longer just in your cottage. You are adrift in a burning sea. You see faces in the shadows, hear the tolling of the non-existent church bell. Inside your own head, you cry out for water, your throat parched and dry. Through the fog of your delirium, you are vaguely aware of your wife. She hasn't fled. She is there. She places a cool, damp cloth on your forehead. The sensation is a momentary anchor in the swirling chaos. She is whispering prayers, her voice trembling. She has made her choice. She has chosen love. It is the most beautiful, and potentially the most fatal, decision of her life. You are now the source of the miasma, the poison in your own home. And as you slip deeper into the fever dream, you had a single, terrifying, lucid thought. Will you wake up? And if you do, who will be left? The night is a long, disjointed nightmare. You are trapped in the furnace of the fever, tossed on waves of delirium. Time loses all meaning. There is only a cycle of burning heat and bone-rattling chills. You are acutely aware of your own body as a landscape of betrayal. Your heart hammers against your ribs, a frantic, irregular drumbeat. Your breath is a shallow, ragged gasp. Then, you feel it. A new and specific kind of pain. A deep, searing ache in your groin. You fumble weakly with your clothes, and your fingers find it. A small, hard lump, no bigger than a pigeon's egg, right in the crease of your leg. It's exquisitely tender. The lightest touch sends a bolt of pure agony through your body. The bubo, the sign of the covenant with death. It has appeared. In your fever-addled state, you are no longer just you. You are a battlefield. You can almost feel the war raging inside your lymph nodes, the invading bacterial horde overwhelming your body's defenses. The development of the bubo is the turning point. The sickness is no longer a generalized fever. It has a capital, a fortress. From this swollen, painful stronghold, it will launch its final assault on your system. Your wife sees the look on your face. She knows what you found. You see the hope drained from her eyes, replaced by a profound, weary grief. She has seen this before. She knows what comes next. The swelling will grow. becoming larger, darker, more agonizing, until it dominates your every waking and sleeping thought. In this moment, lying on your straw pallet, you are utterly helpless. You are at the mercy of a disease with a 70% mortality rate. In an age with no antibiotics, no painkillers, no IV fluids, your survival depends on a handful of variables, none of which you can control. The strength of your own immune system, the specific virulence of the bacterial strain you've contracted, and pure, unadulterated luck. What does a 14th century family do in this situation? They pray. Your wife's voice is a constant, desperate murmur in the background. She prays to Jesus, to the Virgin Mary, to Saint Roch, the patron saint of plague victims, who was said to have survived the disease himself, ministered to by a dog who brought him bread and licked his sores clean. She also turns to the folk remedies whispered through the village. She makes a poultice, not of dried excrement, thank God, but of mashed onions and figs, which she heats by the fire and applies to the swelling. The warmth is a slight, momentary comfort against the deep, searing pain. She brews a bitter tea from herbs gathered in the woods, thistle, wormwood, and other plants believed to purify the blood. It tastes vile, and you can barely keep it down, but you drink it. It's an act of love, a ritual of hope against hopelessness. One of the strangest and most desperate treatments of the era was the scapegoat theory of medicine, applied on a personal level. Besides strapping a live chicken to the boo-ball, some physicians recommended placing a live frog or toad, belly down, on the swelling. They believed the creature would absorb the venom of the plague. The toad would supposedly swell up and eventually burst, having drawn the poison out. This was, of course, completely ineffective, but it speaks to the desperate search for any agent, any vessel, that could take the sickness away. The long hours of the night are a battle. You drift in and out of consciousness. In your lucid moments, the pain from the bubo is a sharp, white-hot beacon. In your delirium, you argue with demons. You see the faces of the village dead. You feel yourself sinking into the earth. You are acutely aware of your own mortality. You think about your children, sleeping in the other room, and a wave of despair, more powerful than the fever, washes over you. Historians and medical experts still ponder the question of immunity and survival. Why did some people, like you in this story, survive while so many others perish? Modern science offers some clues. It's possible that some individuals possessed a specific genetic mutation, like the CCR5 mutation, which is known to provide resistance to HIV and may have also offered some protection against the plague bacterium by making it harder for it to invade cells. This is still a topic of intense research and debate. It's also possible that the dose of bacteria received from the flea bite mattered, or that prior exposure to less virulent forms of the bacterium might have conferred some partial immunity. But for you, on this pallet of straw, it's not about genetics or academic theories. It's about enduring one more breath. One more heartbeat. You feel yourself getting weaker, fading. The world is dissolving at the edges. You can hear your wife sweeping, and it sounds like it's coming from very far away. You are at the precipice. You can feel the pull of the abyss, the sweet, tempting call to just let go, to stop fighting. The pain is too much. The fever is too high. You close your eyes. This is it. This is the end. You surrender to the darkness. You don't know how much time has passed. It could have been hours or days. Your existence has been a formless, timeless void of pain and darkness. But then, something shifts. A tiny, improbable change in the fabric of your perception. You become aware of a feeling. It's not pain. It's not heat. It's wetness. A damp, clammy sensation all over your body. Slowly, consciousness seeps back into you, like water into dry earth. You realize you are drenched in sweat. Your straw pallet, your clothes, everything is soaked through. The relentless, burning heat that has consumed you for an eternity has broken. The fever has cracked. You try to open your eyes. The lids are heavy, crusted shut. It takes a monumental effort, but you manage to pry them open a slit. The familiar sight of your cottage's thatched ceiling swims into view. It's blurry, But it's there. You are still here. Your wife is asleep in a chair beside you, her head slumped on her chest, completely exhausted. The room is quiet, save for the sound of her soft breathing and the gentle chirping of a bird outside. You turn your head, a slow, creaky movement that feels like it requires the strength of 10 men. The pounding in your skull has subsided to a dull, manageable throb. You tentatively check the spot in your groin. The bubo is still there, a large, angry mound, but something is different. The searing, white-hot pain has lessened, replaced by a deep, throbbing ache, and then you see it. The center of the swelling has softened, and a mixture of blood and pus is oozing out, soaking into a makeshift bandage of old cloth. The fortress has burst. The war, it seems, is over. You have survived. You have, against all odds, become one of the lucky few, one of the 30%. You are a survivor. The feeling is not one of triumphant joy. It's one of profound, hollowed-out exhaustion. You feel like a ghost, a fragile echo of your former self. You've been to the edge of death and looked over, and now you've been sent back. This moment of breaking the fever and the subsequent draining of the bubo was the critical turning point for plague survivors. If the patient's immune system was strong enough to finally overcome the bacterial onslaught, the body would mount a massive inflammatory response to clear out the dead bacteria and immune cells from the lymph node. This liquefaction and drainage, while grotesque, was a sign of healing. It meant the body had won the war and was now just cleaning up the battlefield. A little-known aspect of plague survival was the aftermath. Survivors weren't just suddenly better. They faced a long, arduous recovery. They were left incredibly weak, emaciated, and often scarred, both physically and emotionally. The drained bubo would leave behind a deep, open wound that could easily become infected with other bacteria, posing a new threat. Some survivors were also reported to have lasting neurological symptoms, like memory loss or changes in personality, likely due to the prolonged high fever and toxins affecting the brain. The question of immunity after survival is one that historians and epidemiologists have long been interested in. Did surviving the plague once grant you lifelong immunity? The general consensus is yes, for the most part. Accounts from later plague outbreaks often note that survivors of previous waves were able to act as nurses and gravidergs with much lower risk. This acquired immunity made survivors an incredibly valuable resource in a world living under the constant threat of the plague's return. You lie there, taking stock of your own fragile existence. You can hear your children whispering in the other room. They are alive. Your wife stirs, woken by your movement. She sees your open eyes, the sweat on your brow, the state of the bubo. A look of disbelief, then overwhelming relief, washes over her face. Tears stream down her cheeks, but this time, they are not tears of grief. She brings you a spoonful of water, and it's the most incredible thing you've ever tasted. She helps use it up, and the room spins, but it doesn't swallow you. You are weak, you are shattered, but you are alive. A few days later, you are strong enough to stand, to take a few shaky steps. You push open the door of your cottage and step out into the sunlight. The world you re-enter is not the one you left. It's quieter, hauntingly so. The air no longer smells of fragrant herbs, but of decay and neglect. Many of the houses on your street are boarded up or stand eerily silent, their doors swinging open. The village is a ghost of its former self. You have woken from your personal nightmare, but you have woken up into a larger one. A world where the dead outnumber the living. A world that has been fundamentally broken. The joy of your own survival is immediately tempered by the scale of the loss around you. You are an island of life in an ocean of silence. The great challenge wasn't just surviving the plague. It's surviving the world it left behind. As your strength slowly returns, you begin to venture further from your cottage, exploring the new, silent landscape of your world. You walk past the empty houses of your neighbors, people you shared bread with, people whose children played with yours. The silence is a constant, heavy presence, but it's when you walk to the edge of the village, up the hill that overlooks the Lord's lands, that you grasp the full extent of the devastation. The fields, which at this time of year should be bustling with peasants tending the crops, are eerily empty. A plow lies abandoned in a half-tilled furrow, already starting to rust. Weeds are beginning to reclaim the neat rows of wheat and barley. The great collective effort of agriculture, the rhythm that has defined life for centuries, has simply stopped. You look towards the manor house, the modest stone dwelling of your local lord. It too seems deserted. The gates are open. The courtyard is empty. There's no sign of the guards, the servants, the stable hands. You hear a story from another survivor, one of the few you encounter. The lord and his family fled to one of their other properties weeks ago, taking their most essential servants with them. The rest of the staff, left to fend for themselves, either died or ran away. The castle that looms on the distant horizon, the seat of the regional nobleman, is a similar story. You hear that he and his entire family, along with most of his court, perished within a single week. The symbol of power and permanence that has dominated the skyline your entire life is now just a stone tomb. What you are witnessing is the complete shattering of the feudal system. This rigid, hierarchical structure was built on a foundation of obligations. Peasants like you worked the land. In return, the lord offered protection and a small strip of land for your own use. The lord, in turn, owed fealty and military service to a greater noble, who owed it to the king. It was a pyramid of power, built on the broad back of a large, stable peasant population. The Black Death took a sledgehammer to that foundation. With up to half the population gone, the system simply ceased to function. There weren't enough peasants to work the land. There weren't enough craftsmen to shoe the horses or mill the grain. There weren't enough soldiers to fill the garrisons. The lords couldn't meet their obligations to their superiors because their workforce had vanished. The entire pyramid was crumbling from the bottom up. This led to some bizarre and unprecedented situations. You see fields dotted with wandering livestock, sheep, cows, pigs, their owners dead. For a brief period, for those who survived, meat was suddenly plentiful. Anyone could round up an announced sheep and roast it. This is a strange, little-known consequence of the plague, a short-lived protein boom for the poorest in society. Of course, this was unsustainable. With no one to manage the herds, they were soon depleted by predators and starvation. But for a moment, the old rules of ownership had completely broken down. Historians are still debating the precise speed and nature of this collapse. Some argue that the feudal system was already under strain before the plague, due to famine and overpopulation, and that the Black Death was simply the final, decisive blow. Others maintain that the system was more resilient and that the plague triggered a crisis so profound and so rapid that no institution could have withstood it. The great abandonment of villages, known as Wüstungen in German historical records, became a common feature of the European landscape. Entire communities were wiped off the map, their locations only rediscovered by modern archaeologists centuries later. You walk through the overgrown fields, the silence broken only by the wind. The world feels wild again, as if civilization itself is receding. The neatly ordered landscape of the manor economy is giving way to chaos in nature. This is a terrifying sight. Your entire life, and the lives of your ancestors, have been defined by the struggle to tame this land, to make it productive. To see it being undone is to see your very purpose in life disintegrate. But as you stand there, looking at the lordless land and the empty manor, a new, radical thought begins to form in your mind. A thought that would have been unthinkable, even heretical, a year ago. If the Lord is gone, who owns this land? If there are 10 times more fields than there are people to work them, what is a single farmer's labor now worth? The old certainties are gone. The Lord who demanded your labor and your loyalty is gone. The system that kept you tied to this specific patch of earth is broken. For the first time in your life, you are not just a serf, a possession of the manor. You are a survivor, a free agent in a broken world. The thought is both exhilarating and terrifying. The pyramid has collapsed, and you are standing in the rubble, looking up at an open sky, having survived the sickness and witnessed the collapse of the old order. you now face a new, more insidious enemy. Hunger. The abandoned fields and lordless manors are not a sign of freedom, but a harbinger of famine. The intricate web of production and distribution that fed your world has been torn to shreds. You return to the village, which is less a community now and more a loose collection of shell-shocked survivors. The immediate problem is bread. The last harvest, brought in before the plague hits peak, is running out. The village baker is dead. His oven's cold. The miller who turned the grain into flour is also gone. The great water wheel of his mill creaking idly in the wind. The few of you who are left have to do everything yourselves. You find sacks of raw wheat in the Lord's abandoned storehouse. But turning wheat into bread is a multi-step process that used to involve a whole chain of specialized labor. Now, you and a few other families have to figure out how to do it all. You try to grind the wheat between two stones. A backbreaking, inefficient process. The flour you produce is coarse and gritty. Your attempts at baking over an open fire result in loaves that are either burned on the outside or doughy on the inside. Food, which was once a simple, daily commodity, has become a luxury, and its price is skyrocketing. In the first few weeks after the plague's peak, there was a strange deflation. The belongings of the dead flooded the market, and you could buy a dead man's pot or his cloak for next to nothing. But that quickly changed. The things that mattered, food, salt, ale, became incredibly scarce. Labor was gone, so production had stopped. A traveling merchant, one of the first brave enough to venture back onto the roads, arrives in your village with a cart of grain. The price he asks for a single sack is astronomical, 10 times what it was a year ago. He knows she is the only supplier. He can name his price, and you have to pay it or starve. This is the beginning of the great post-plague inflation, with a drastic shortage of laborers to farm the land, herd the animals, and transport the goods. The cost of everything produced by labor soared. At the same time, the survivors, especially those who inherited property from their dead relatives, had more money than ever before. It was a perfect storm, a flood of new money chasing a dwindling supply of goods. This economic chaos led to some truly bizarre market conditions. For example, while the price of wheat and barley, which are labor-intensive, went through the roof, the price of things that didn't require much human effort could plummet. Land, for instance, with so much of it suddenly vacant, its value dropped precipitously. You could, in theory, acquire a huge tract of land for a pittance, but it was worthless if you couldn't find anyone to work it. Historians have meticulously studied price and wage records from this period, and they paint a fascinating picture of an economy in turmoil. They debate the immediate versus long-term effects. Was the crippling inflation a short-term shock, or did it set a new, permanent baseline for the cost of living? Most agree that the fundamental relationship between labor, capital, and land was altered forever. This period saw the first attempts by governments to control the economy through legislation. In England, for instance, the government issued the Ordinance of Labourers in 1349 and later, the Statute of Labourers in 1351. These laws tried to freeze wages at their pre-plague levels, making it illegal for peasants to demand more pay and for lords to offer it. It was a desperate attempt by the ruling class to put the genie of peasant power back in the bottle. This legislation was, for the most part, a spectacular failure. You can't legislate supply and demand. The laws were widely ignored, and a black market for labor quickly developed. Lords, desperate for anyone to work their fields, would secretly offer higher wages or better conditions to lure peasants away from other manors. You feel this new reality in your own stomach. The gritty, half-baked bread you make from scavenged grain is barely enough to keep your family alive. The gnawing ache of hunger is a constant companion, a cruel epilogue to the terror of the fever. You survived the disease, only to face the prospect of starving in a world of plenty, a world of empty fields and untended orchards. You look at your own hands, calloused from a lifetime of farm work. A year ago, these hands were just one pair among thousands, cheap and replaceable. Now, they are a rare and precious commodity. This realization doesn't fill your belly, but it plants a seed of an idea. Your labor has value, real value, and maybe, just maybe, you can use that value to build a new life out of the ruins of the old one. The fight for survival is no longer against a disease, but against an economic system that is trying to pretend the world has changed. Just as a fragile sense of normalcy begins to take root in your shattered village, a new wave of terror ripples through the land. The first summer after the Great Dying gives way to autumn, and in a cold, damp winter, you and the other survivors have worked hard, clearing a small section of the fields, pooling your resources to ensure you have enough to survive until the next harvest. You've even begun to dream of a future. But the plague, it turns in, is not a storm that passes once. It's a recurring season. The news comes, as it always does, with a traveler, a peddler on his way from a southern port city, his face etched with a familiar, haunted look. He tells you that the sickness has returned. In some cities, it's not as severe as the first wave, but in others, it's just as deadly. The difference this time, he says, is the victims. The first wave seemed to kill indiscriminately. Young, old, strong, weak. This second wave, he whispers, seems to be targeting the children, especially those born since the first pestilence. The news lands like a punch to the gut. You look at your own children. They are your reason for surviving, the living embodiment of your hope for the future. The idea that the plague might return specifically for them is a horror beyond anything you've yet endured. This phenomenon was tragically real. The second major outbreak, which struck in 1361, was often called the pestis puerorum, the plague of children. While it did affect adults, it had a disproportionately high mortality rate among the young, devastating the very generation that was supposed to rebuild the population. This recurrence of the plague created a new, terrifying psychological reality for the survivors. The first outbreak was an apocalyptic event, a singular cataclysm. Its return proved that it was not an anomaly, but a permanent feature of their world. They were now living in what some historians call a plague-positive society. The threat was always there, lurking, ready to flare up again every few years. Subsequent outbreaks occurred in 1316, and throughout the next few centuries, each one reinforcing the sense of insecurity and fear. This constant threat had a profound effect on the medieval psyche. People's perception of time changed. Why make long-term plans? Why invest in the future when the plague could return at any moment and wipe it all away? This led, in some, to a kind of fatalistic hedonism, a desire to live for the moment. But in others, it created a state of perpetual, low-grade anxiety, a collective PTSD that shaped their art, their religion, and their social structures for generations. A lesser-known consequence of these recurring waves was their impact on family structures and marriage. With such high mortality rates, especially among children, people married younger and had more children, hoping that some would survive to adulthood. The traditional, multi-generational family unit became harder to maintain. Society became populated by orphans, widows, and widowers, who often remarried quickly, creating complex blended families. The very definition of family became more fluid and fragile. The academic debate continues over why the second wave was so deadly for children. One theory is that the adult survivors of the 13,471,351 outbreak had acquired robust immunity, which the children, having never been exposed, lacked entirely. They were a naive population, in epidemiological terms, and thus incredibly vulnerable. Another theory suggests that the children born in the immediate aftermath of the first plague were already weakened by the poor nutrition and social chaos of the post-plague world, making them more susceptible to the disease. It was a cruel one to punch. The generation meant to be the recovery was born into a world that made them too weak to survive the next blow. The peddler's news throws your village into a panic. The fragile trust you had begun to rebuild evaporates overnight. People become suspicious of each other again. Every cough, every feverish child is seen as a potential sign of the plague's return. You find yourself watching your own children with an obsessive, fearful gaze, checking their skin for any mark, feeling their foreheads for any hint of warmth. The ghost has returned. You thought you had survived the war, but you learned that it was only the first battle. The enemy was not vanquished. It had merely retreated to gather its strength. You are now living in occupied territory, under the shadow of a tyrant who can strike at any time. Without warning, without reason. This changes everything. The hope you had carefully nurtured now seems like a foolish luxury. The future you were beginning to imagine is once again shrouded in fog. Survival, you realize, is not a single event. It's a permanent, ongoing struggle against a foe that will never truly go away. The fear of the plague's return hangs heavy in the air, a constant, low-grade dread. But amidst the anxiety and the hardship, you begin to witness one of the strangest and most profound social shifts to emerge from the ashes of the old world. You see ordinary people who were once at the very bottom of the social ladder, suddenly becoming wealthy and powerful. It starts with a man named William, who used to be a simple tenant farmer, not much better off than you. He was one of 7 brothers. The plague took his parents and all 6 of his siblings. His family had been free peasants, not serfs, and they owned a modest plot of land. But his uncle was a moderately successful wool merchant in a nearby town, and he too died, along with his wife and children, through a complex but undeniable chain of inheritance. William, the sole surviving male heir of his entire extended family, suddenly finds himself the legal owner of his family's farm, his uncle's townhouse, the merchant business, and a surprising amount of gold coin. A year ago, William was covered in mud. Now, HES wearing fine clothes and trying to figure out how to manage a business he knows nothing about. He is, for all intents and purposes, a new man. He is an accidental aristocrat, a creation of the plague. This story, or versions of it, is happening all over Europe. The Black Death didn't just kill people, it radically redistributed wealth, with entire families being wiped out. The laws of inheritance, which were designed for a world of slow, predictable change, suddenly went into overdrive. A distant cousin, a forgotten nephew, or in some cases, a shrewd widow, could suddenly find themselves in possession of vast fortunes. This sudden, often random, social mobility was utterly shocking to the medieval mindset, which was built on the idea of a fixed, God-given social order. You were born a peasant, you died a peasant. You were born a noble, you died a noble. But the plague was the great equalizer, and it didn't respect these boundaries. It tore down the old hierarchies with an indifferent hand. This phenomenon gave rise to a new class of people, the nouveau riches, or new rich. These were individuals who had the money and assets of the upper classes, but not the traditional lineage, education, or manners. This created enormous social friction. The old nobility, what was left of them, looked down on these upstarts with contempt, seeing them as vulgar and undeserving. Meanwhile, the new rich often engaged in conspicuous consumption, buying lavish clothes, building grand houses, and throwing extravagant parties to show off their newfound wealth and cement their social standing. One of the more peculiar and less discussed consequences of this was the boom in the luxury goods market. One might think that in a post-apocalyptic world, people would be focused on necessities, but for the new rich, proving their status was a necessity. There was a huge demand for fine silks, elaborate jewelry, expensive spices, and detailed artwork. This, in turn, fueled a recovery in trade and craftsmanship, but one that was geared towards this new, high-end market. Historians are still analyzing legal documents like wills and property records to trace the full impact of this massive, unplanned wealth transfer. They debate its long-term effects. Did it create a more dynamic and meritocratic society, or did it simply replace one elite with another, equally entrenched one? Some argue that this sudden influx of new blood into the Upper East Sea minuted new ideas and business practices, helping to lay the groundwork for the more capitalist economy that would follow. It broke the monopoly of the old, landed aristocracy and opened the door for a more powerful merchant class. You see this playing out in your own small world. William, the new merchant, is clumsy and makes mistakes, but HES also unburdened by tradition. HES willing to take risks the old merchant families never would have. He starts trading with new partners. He experiments with different kinds of wool, and he pays his workers, the few he can find, a higher wage to ensure their loyalty. He is, in his own small way, inventing a new way of doing business. For you, this is a source of both wonder and resentment. You are happy for William, the man you know, but you can't help but feel a pang of jealousy. His good fortune was born from the same tragedy that left you with nothing but your own life. It all feels so random, so unjust. Survival was a lottery, and inheritance was a second, even more arbitrary one. You look at William, awkwardly trying to play the part of a wealthy townsman, and you realize you are looking at the future. The old, rigid pyramid of society is gone. In its place is something new, something more fluid and chaotic. It's a world where a man's destiny is no longer written at his birth. It can be rewritten overnight by a roll of the dice, by the whim of a disease. It's a world of bewildering, terrifying, and perhaps even hopeful. New possibilities. The rise of the new rich like William is a spectacle you watch from a distance. It doesn't change your own immediate reality, which is still a daily struggle for survival. But the same force that catapulted him to wealth is now beginning to shift the ground under your own feet. That force is the simple, brutal arithmetic of labor. There are far fewer people to do the work, and you are one of them. Your sweat has become a valuable commodity. The first sign of this change comes from the steward of your old manor. The Lord, who had fled the plague, has finally returned to his estate, only to find it in ruins. His fields are overgrown, his buildings are in disrepair, and his workforce is gone. He is a king with no subjects, desperate to get his lands productive again. He sends his steward to round up the surviving peasants. The steward finds you and the handful of other able-bodied men in the village. A year ago, his arrival would have been an order. He would have told you to report for work, and you would have had no choice. Serfdom was a binding obligation. But today, the conversation is different. He tells you that the Lord will be generous. You can return to work the fields, and your obligations will be the same as before. You look at the other men. You see a flicker of something new in their eyes. Defiance. An old farmer, a man who has bowed his head to the Lord his entire life, is the first to speak. He says the old terms are no longer acceptable. The work is harder now. With fewer hands, they need better conditions. They need more days to work their own small plots of land, and they need to be paid with actual coin. The steward is flabbergasted. This is not a negotiation. It's an insurrection. He threatens. He cajoles. He reminds you of your sacred duty to the Lord. But the threat is empty. What can he do? Evict you. There's a dozen empty plots you could move to tomorrow. Punish you. He has no one to enforce his will. You stand with the other man. Your silence a powerful assent. You are terrified, but you are also united. You have, for the first time, leverage. This scene was the crux of the great post-plague labor crisis. For centuries, the abundance of cheap peasant labor had kept the feudal system chugging along. The Black Death turned that equation on its head. Suddenly, labor was the scarce resource, and land was plentiful. Peasants, for the first time, were in a position to bargain. They began to vote with their feet. If a lord wouldn't meet their demands, they would simply pack up and move to a neighboring manor where the lord was offering better terms. This created a competitive market for labor, something that had never existed before. Serfs were illegally breaking their bonds to the land and becoming free laborers, selling their services to the highest bidder. This is what prompted the ruling classes to enact repressive laws like England's Statute of Labor Hours, which tried to cap wages and forbid peasants from moving. These laws were a desperate attempt to hold back the tide of economic change, to preserve the power of the landed aristocracy. A lesser-known fact is that these laws also often included clauses against giving alms to able-bodied beggars. forcing them into the workforce, and stipulated that food must be sold at reasonable prices, an attempt to curb the inflation that was hurting the lords as much as anyone. Historians often refer to the period after the Black Death as a golden age for the European peasantry. While golden might be an overstatement for people still living hard lives, there's no doubt that their economic position improved dramatically. Real wages for laborers and craftsmen in England, for example, are estimated to have doubled or even tripled in the decades following the plague. They ate better, with more meat and dairy in their diet. They could afford better clothing and improvements to their homes. The fundamental power balance between the common man and the ruling class had shifted. The debate among historians is about how this golden age ended. Some argue that as the population began to slowly recover over the next century, the labor surplus returned, and the peasants' bargaining power eroded. Others point to the organized and often violent pushback from the nobility in the state, who eventually succeeded in reasserting their control. The steward, seeing your united front, has no choice but to relent. He agrees, grudgingly, to take your demands back to the Lord. A week later, he returns with a new offer. It's not everything you asked for, but it's more than you ever could have dreamed of a year ago. A portion of your work will be paid in silver coin. Your obligations to work the Lord's domain are reduced. It's a victory. You go back to work in the fields, but everything is different. You are not just a serf, an extension of the land. You are an employee. You are being paid for your time, for your skill. The coins in your pocket are more than just money. They are a symbol of your new status. They are proof that your life has value, not just to God, but to the world of men. The social pyramid has just been shaken. Its very foundation is being rebuilt, and you are one of the architects. Years begin to pass. The gaping wound of the great pestilence slowly starts to scar over. The recurring waves of plague are a constant, terrifying threat. But life, somehow, adapts. The world is emptier, quieter, but it is also being rebuilt. And as you get older, you start to see this new reality reflected in the most unexpected of places. In art, one day, you travel to a nearby town for a market fair. The town's main church, which was damaged in a fire years ago, has finally been repaired. You step inside, seeking a moment of peace from the bustling market. The interior is dark and cool, but on one of the newly plastered walls, a huge, startling mural has been painted. It's unlike any religious art you've ever seen. It's not a serene portrait of the Virgin Mary or a majestic depiction of Christ on the cross. Instead, it's a chaotic, energetic, and deeply macabre scene. A line of figures, led by a grinning, skeletal figure playing a pipe, snakes across the wall. But it's the people in the line that make you stop and stare. There's a pope, his triple tiara askew. Next to him is a mighty emperor, his crown falling from his head. Then a bishop, a knight, a wealthy merchant, and a poor peasant just like you. Each one is being pulled along by a dancing skeleton. Their faces a mixture of horror, surprise, and resignation. This is the dance macabre, the dance of death. It's a new artistic obsession that is sweeping across post-plague Europe. It's a stark, powerful reminder of a lesson the whole world has just learned the hard way. Death is the ultimate democratizer. It doesn't care about your wealth, your piety, or your social status. The skeleton comes for everyone. The message is both terrifying and, in a strange way, comforting for a man like you, who has spent his life at the bottom of the social ladder. There is a grim satisfaction in seeing a painting that shows the Pope and the Emperor being humbled by the same force that took your neighbors. It's an artistic expression of the social upheaval you've lived through. The old hierarchies that seemed so solid in God, given have been revealed as fragile and temporary. This theme became incredibly pervasive. It appeared not just in church murals, but in woodcut prints that could be cheaply reproduced and distributed, in stained glass windows, and even in the margins of prayer books. The figure of the skeleton was no longer just a morbid symbol of decay. It was an active, almost mischievous character, a great leveler who exposes the vanity of earthly life, a lesser known, but equally fascinating artistic trend that emerged from this period is known as Ars Moriendi, or the art of dying. These were extant images that served as practical and spiritual guides on how to have a good death, with the clergy often absent in the fear of dying without last rites so prevalent. These guides became incredibly popular. They offered advice on how to resist the temptations of the devil on your deathbed, how to make a final confession directly to God, and how to die with piety and acceptance. It was a form of self-help for the soul, a way for people to reclaim control over the one moment they feared the most. Historians are still debating the full psychological meaning of the Danse Macabre. Was it a purely religious message about the vanity of worldly things and the importance of being prepared for judgment, or was it also a form of social commentary, a subtle critique of the powerful, a reflection of the peasant's newfound sense of worth? Some scholars see it as a sign of a deep, collective trauma, a society obsessed with the morbid because it was surrounded by death. Others see it as a sign of resilience, an attempt to process and make sense of the catastrophe through art, to tame the horror by giving it a form and a narrative. You stand in the cool silence of the church, looking at the painted figures. You see the skeleton grabbing the hand of the peasant, who looks weary but not particularly surprised. And you recognize yourself. You have already had your dance with death. You felt its bony fingers on your skin, heard its music in the delirium of your fever. You survived. The mural isn't just about death. It's about life. It's a reminder that life is fleeting, that power is an illusion, and that in the end, all anyone has is their own soul. You leave the church and step back out into the bright, noisy marketplace. The world feels different. The painting has given you a new lens through which to see it. It has validated your experience, put your suffering into a grand, universal context. The world may be broken, but its artists are finding a powerful new voice to describe it. You are an old man now. Your hair is white, your back is bent from a lifetime of labor, and your skin is a roadmap of wrinkles. You have lived through more history than any generation before you could have possibly imagined. You survived the great dying of 1348. You endured the pestis puerorum that took so many children. You've seen the plague return again and again, a recurring ghost that never quite goes away. You sit outside your small cottage, now repaired and expanded, watching your grandchildren play in the yard. They are a generation born into a different world. They have only ever known a world where labor is valued, where a peasant can own his own land, and where the Lord's power is a shadow of what it once was. For them, the stories you tell of the time before the plague, of strict serfdom and unquestioned authority, sound like tales from a mythical age. The plague itself has changed. It still returns, every decade or so, to cull the population, but its character seems to have shifted. The outbreaks are often more localized, less like a universal firestorm and more like a series of smaller, contained fires. People have learned, through brutal experience, some basic methods of control. The concept of quarantine, which Moan practiced so ruthlessly, has become more widespread and organized. When the plague appears in a town, ships are held in the harbor for 40 days, a quarantena in Italian, giving us our modern word. Cities will shut their gates, and plague hospitals, called Lazar ATTOS, are established outside the city walls to isolate the sick. These measures are clumsy, often brutal, but they work. Mankind is no longer just a passive victim. It is learning, slowly and painfully, how to fight back. You often wonder, has the plague truly gone away, or is it just sleeping? You hear stories from travelers of a similar sickness in distant lands, under different names. It seems the monster was never truly slain, but simply retreated into the wilderness, into the populations of wild rodents, where it waits. This is a truth that modern science has confirmed. The Black Death, caused by Yersinia pestis, never completely vanished. It continued to cause epidemics in Europe until the 18th century, with the Great Plague of London in 1665 and the Plague of Marseille in 1720 being among the last major European outbreaks. After that, it largely disappeared from Europe. but continued to smolder elsewhere. The so-called third pandemic began in China in the late 19th century and spread worldwide, including to the United States. A little-known fact is that Yersinia pestis still exists today. The bacterium survives in rodent populations in various parts of the world, including the American Southwest. Each year, a handful of people in the U.S. and elsewhere still contract the bubonic plague, usually from flea bites after contact with infected animals like prairie dogs or squirrels. Thankfully, we now have a powerful weapon that you could never have dreamed of: antibiotics. With modern medicine, the plague that had a 70% mortality rate in your time is now treatable, with a mortality rate of around 10% if caught early. The monster has been tamed, reduced from an apocalyptic force to a rare, manageable disease. The historical debate about the plague's disappearance from Europe is fascinating. Why did it vanish after centuries of recurring terror? There's no single answer. One theory is evolutionary. The human population may have developed a greater genetic resistance over time. Another theory points to changes in the rat population. The black rat, Rattus rattus, which lives in close proximity to humans, was gradually displaced by the bigger, more aggressive brown rat, Rattus norvegicus, which tends to live further from human dwellings, breaking the chain of transmission. Improvements in housing stone instead of wattle and daub, sanitation, and the effectiveness of quarantines also certainly played a major role. It was likely a combination of all these factors that finally drove the plague from the continent. You look at your grandchildren, their faces full of life and ignorant of the true horror their grandparents endured. You feel a sense of profound accomplishment. You survived. You rebuilt. You carved out a better world for them. Not through grand design, but through the simple, stubborn act of continuing to live. You think back to that first cough from the blacksmith, the terror of the bubo, the silence of the church bell, the flight into the countryside. It feels like a lifetime ago. A different world. You have witnessed the end of that world, and you have stood at the dawn of a new one. The fear never completely leaves you. In the quiet of the night, you can still sometimes hear the phantom cry of the cartman, "Bring out your dead." But now, there is another sound too. The laughter of your grandchildren. It is the sound of the future. The sound of life going on. The sun is low in the sky, casting long shadows across the valley. From your seat on the small wooden bench outside your home, the world looks peaceful. So, the fields are green and gold. The village is humming with the quiet activity of evening, and the laughter of your grandchildren is a gentle music in the air. It is hard, sometimes, to reconcile this tranquil scene with the world of fire and shadow that lives in your memory. You are a bridge between two worlds, the one you were born into. The world of unquestioning faith, of rigid order, of life lived in the long shadow of the manor and the church, is gone. It died with the blacksmith, with the priest, with the lord in his castle. The world you now live in, the world your grandchildren will inherit, is a different place entirely. It is a world remade, rebuilt on a mountain of bones. You've seen it in subtle ways and in profound ones. The old feudal ties, the bonds of serfdom that felt as natural as the seasons, are a distant memory. Men like you, who survived, discovered their own worth. They learned to sell their labor, to make demands, to build lives of modest independence. The coins that passed through your hands were more than currency. They were a declaration of self-worth. You saw the church, once the unshakable bedrock of reality, stumble and crack when its prayers failed, when its priests died. Just like common men, people didn't necessarily lose their faith in God, but they lost their unquestioning faith in the institution. They began to look for answers elsewhere, in their own hearts, in their own communities, and in the tangible world around them. They began to trust their own eyes and their own reason a little more. And this, you realize, is the greatest change of all. The focus has shifted. The medieval mind was always looking up, towards heaven, towards the afterlife. Life on earth was a temporary trial, a pilgrimage of suffering to be endured for a divine reward. But the plague, in its brutal finality, forced people's eyes downward, to the earth, to the here and now. When the afterlife seemed so terrifyingly close, the present moment became infinitely precious. The old philosophy of memento mori, remember you must die, slowly began to transform into something new, a quiet insistence on living. This new way of thinking needed new tools, new knowledge. The old books and the old authorities had failed. So, men began to look for older ones. They started digging up the texts of the ancient Greeks and Romans, thinkers who celebrated human reason, human beauty, and the potential of man. It was a rebirth of old knowledge, a renaissance. Here's a strange and specific consequence of the plague you heard about from a traveling scholar. The study of the human body itself changed. The old medicine of humors and mias had proven to be a catastrophic failure. A new generation of physicians, desperate for real answers, began to do something that was once largely forbidden and unthinkable. They began to dissect human corpses. They wanted to see, with their own eyes, the landscape of the body, to understand how it worked, how it broke. This new emphasis on direct observation, on empirical evidence over received wisdom, was a quiet revolution that began on a cold slab, all thanks to the questions the plague had forced them to ask. Historians, in their comfortable future, will argue endlessly about this. Did the Black Death cause the Renaissance, or did it merely accelerate trends that were already in motion? They will point out that the great trading cities of Italy were already wealthy, that universities were already growing, that the seeds of humanism were already planted before the first plague ship ever docked in Messina. They will argue, and they will be right, that it is too simple to say that one event created another. But you know what you saw? You saw a world held in a rigid stasis, shattered into a million pieces, and into that void, that vacuum of power and certainty, something new had the space to grow. The plague was not the seed of the Renaissance, perhaps, but it was the forest fire that cleared the land, the flood that washed away the old structures, the terrible, bloody fertilizer that allowed those seeds to sprout and flourish in a way they never could have before. You close your eyes, the warmth of the setting sun on your face. You have lived through the end of an age. You have seen horror and despair that words can never truly capture. But you have also seen the astonishing resilience of the human spirit. You've seen how, from the deepest, darkest pit of tragedy, new ideas, new art, and a new sense of human potential can be born. The world was not just rebuilt, it was reborn. And you, the boy who once huddled in a cottage listening to a neighbor's cough, were here to witness it all.